Here is a story from a Christian book. In the Gospel of Luke, the story is introduced by a question known as the Great Commandment. A lawyer stood up and tested Jesus, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus replied, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And the lawyer answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But the lawyer, because you know lawyers, wanted to justify himself and asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus replies with a story. A certain man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him, and left him for half dead. By chance, a certain priest was going down that way. When the priest saw the beaten man, he passed on the other side of the road and went past. In the same way, a Levite also, when he came to the place, saw the beaten man, crossed to the other side, and kept going. But a certain Samaritan, a separate, despised Jewish group, came where the beaten man was. When he saw him, he was moved with compassion, came to him, bound up his wounds, pouring oil and wine. He set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of the beaten man. On the next day, when the traveler departed, he took out 2 coins, gave them to the host, and said, "Take care of this person. Whatever you spend beyond that, I will repay you when I return." Now, which of the 3 do you think seemed to be a neighbor to him who fell among the robbers? And the lawyer said, "He who showed mercy on him." And Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." This is often referred to as the parable of the Good Samaritan, which I had never read before until last night. It's a story about spiritual discipline, and the spiritual discipline of loving your neighbor, especially the injured or hurting neighbor, even if they are not your family or friend. And I wonder, how does that resonate with 21st century Canadian Unitarian Universalists, especially here in Cascadia, the western edge of the Cascade Mountains? What do we think of that kind of love, that kind of discipline, and that kind of spirit? I want to thank our friend Colin Nelson for last week's homily on love as the answer. At the end of today's homily, you will know that if you have questions about romantic love, talk to Colin. If you have questions about theoretical love, talk to me. One of the things I realized writing this homily is that we often don't talk about the Unitarian principles here. So I asked Amanda at the last minute, and thank you, Amanda. There are 8 principles. And Unitarians in Canada have been using the first 7, and the 8th one is sort of a new one. And here they are. Why don't we read them out? Just for laughs. So the 7 principles, the 8 principles are, first one, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. A free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. The goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And individual and communal action that accountably dismantles racism and systemic violence, I think. Injustice? Injustice. Okay. So interesting that we don't talk about the principles very often in this Unitarian congregation. So for newcomers and for those new to Unitarian Universalism, let me point out that UUism in North America has different flavors between the United States and Canada since at least the 1980s. I attended a large Unitarian gathering in 2002 in Quebec City, where the split was formalized and the Canadian Unitarian Council became a religious association independent from the United States. only in 2002. Most Canadian congregations continue to rely on the 8 principles and 6 sources. U.S. congregations have consigned the principles and sources to their history books in favor of a set of values with love at the center. The values are represented by the acronym JETPIG, as you can see on the cover of the order of service today. If you have an order of service, you can see the JETPIG with love at the center. And it's justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, independence, and generosity. JETPIG. Canadian Unitarians and Universalists have not adopted the JETPIG values, but we are influenced by them in part because Unitarian Universalist ministers continue to be administered in Boston and not in Canada. Thank you. I looked for statements on the website of the American Unitarian Universalist Association, headquartered in Boston, about this spiritual discipline of love, which they explicitly state the JETPIG values are about. Fortunately for me, a member of the UUA staff wrote a sermon about this. In his sermon, The Spiritual Discipline of Love, the Reverend Philip Lund starts with the UU principles, and our third principle, which says, don't have to put it back up, encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. What does it mean? Does it apply only to individuals or to congregations? If Unitarian Universalism is to remain relevant, perhaps it's time for us to embrace the spiritual discipline of love and move from a spirituality of me to one of we. I need to acknowledge that I'm going to be quoting a lot from Reverend Philip Lund. He writes that spirituality is mentioned just one time in the old UU principles. The UUA has revised the section of its bylaws, and it's no surprise, given that the UUA is moving to a greater emphasis on spirituality, that these proposed revisions, including JETPIG and the words around JETPIG, the words spirit, spiritual, and spirituality are mentioned in these values several times. Here's the exact wording from the UUA in Boston. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love, capital L, love. Also, we covenant to collectively transform and grow spiritually and ethically. And we cultivate a spirit of gratitude and hope. Now, I love the idea of cultivating a spirit of gratitude and hope, but for the purposes of his sermon, Lund wanted to focus on the 2 uses of spiritual and spiritually because he thought that they had something that the third principle did not have. And specifically, he thinks that spiritual growth is a collective experience. We've never seen it that way here. I don't know about you, but for the longest time when I thought about spiritual growth, my mind would go to images of monks and nuns and saints fervently praying alone in their chambers. I think I was being influenced by Bible verses where Jesus says, when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by other people. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. To be honest, this solo take on spirituality fit perfectly with the kind of individualism that our faith promotes. I've heard it referred to in many ways, and it refers to most of North America, where religion as well as society is individualistic. A closer look at the JETPIG values. We are accountable to one another for doing the work of living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. We're accountable to one another, and we're here to collectively transform and grow spiritually. What this new language advocates is not just an individual spirituality, but something else, a communal spirituality. If we were to do things like lengthy meditative silence or Lectio Divina from time to time throughout the year, we would not only be encouraging spiritual growth in one another, we might collectively transform our religious community spiritually. And where does love fit in with all of this? Well, the word love isn't even in the old principles. We've talked about that in here. It is in the sources. The Reverend Philip Lund concludes, I propose that we use these spiritual services to focus our hearts on love with a capital L. From the readings and meditations that we use to the hymns and chants we sing, let love be at the center of those services. Let us publicly and collectively celebrate that our deepest common theological grounding and value is this, love. That's the end of Dr. Philip Lund for now. In the advertising blurb for today's service, I wrote that the American UUA calls on members to apply the spiritual discipline of love to the work of living our shared values. And I asked, how do they define love? How do they define discipline? And how do they define spiritual? It should not surprise you to know that there's a business side to church and to all religion in North America. There's marketing and there's operations. There are bills to be paid and souls to be saved. Moses, Jesus of Nazareth, and Prophet Muhammad had to think of all these human aspects too. Like Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, Capital's board and staff, see, Capital, Moses, are constantly thinking about what our community needs to hear, what messaging we put out in the world via social media and newspaper ads, and how to maintain the health and vibrancy of this Capital UU congregation. We're not alone in this. Victoria, the least religious city in Canada, still has dozens and dozens of different houses of worship, including 4 Jewish congregations, a Hindu temple, Catholic and Christian congregations of all shapes and sizes, and Sikh gurdwaras, like the one next to us across the parking lot from Norway House. Victoria also has yoga studios and wonderful parks for those kinds of spiritual experience. We don't hear much anymore about fraternal organizations like the Elks and the Rotary and the Kinsmen, the Legion and the Masons. Those were outfits that offered community and sometimes discipline, but Victoria has more non-religious choirs than any city its size. And maybe choirs are offering love, discipline, and spirituality. You could talk to Dick and Kathy if you're looking for a choir. Does Capital offer the spiritual discipline of love? Do we even offer love or discipline or spirituality? For as long as I've been attending, Capital UU has offered a community of left-of-center progressive folks who seek like-minded people to be with. 2, interesting homilies and discussions based on UU principles. 3, a place for religious refugees and searchers to do their personal work around belief. And 4, good music. I used to say great music, but a friend of mine has been attending the Pentecostal church on Quadra recently, and he says their music is awesome, and I watched it. Your music is fantastic. Don't go to the Pentecostal church, stay with us. Many people find love at Capital, and it's the friendly, brotherly, sisterly, or platonic love, which the ancient Greeks called philia. Some folks have found romantic love, or Greek eros, at Capital, but the board and the marketing team can't advertise that as a feature. It's more of a bug. Does Capital offer spirituality? Many people tell me that they feel uplifted in a Capital UU service, and some people might call that uplift a spiritual feeling. You might feel closer to the divine in whatever way you define the divine, in part because of your connection to this community. But I don't think spirituality is something we consistently and reliably offer. And do we offer discipline? I think Capital UU offers politeness in a Canadian way. We invite you to live by the UU principles, but we don't even print those on wallet cards or recite them so you can know what they are. We certainly do not ask you to memorize the principles. And if I and the other leaders do not overtly rely on the principles, how could we ever expect you to approach any spiritual discipline about them? Years ago, I heard a UU leader say that congregations do not make people UU. Rather, we attract people who are already UU in their hearts and minds. And as a result, they find a comfortable landing place here. That's what Belief-O-Matic does. You do the online Belief-O-Matic survey, then the Belief-O-Matic algorithm tells you which religion you most closely align with, and you can choose to check it out. UUism in Canada and the US is highly individualistic, as I quoted from Reverend Philip earlier this morning. We feel that you are responsible for your search for truth and meaning. It's up to you if you want to put love at the center of your search and your life. I wish our American cousins, our American UU cousins, all good things with their new statement of values. JETPIG with love at the center. I will continue to strive for a principled life of individualism and humanism, and to answer the call of love in a friendly, platonic, polite, and non-disciplined way. I look forward to a lively forum where we continue to discuss the spiritual discipline of love. Thank you.